This episode of The History Guy is brought to you by Magellan TV and their new documentary, Above and Beyond, the true survival story of Colonel Bruce Sunderland. The winter of 1943-44 was difficult for the Allies fighting on the Italian peninsula. They had landed on mainland Italy in September, but the terrain was well suited to defense and had proven anything but a soft underbelly, despite the surrender of the Italian government in September and its declaring war on its former German allies in October. But the Allies had one significant advantage, because they figured that the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, was too exhausted, spread too thin, and too focused on defending Germany to be able to play any significant role in deterring the Allied advance in Italy. On December 2nd, 1943, Air Marshal Sir Richard Cunningham held a press conference where he said, "I would consider it a personal affront and an insult if the Luftwaffe were to attempt any significant action in this area." And that affront would come just hours later. The air raid on Bari was not just a disaster for the Allies, it was an embarrassment, the details of which would not be revealed for decades. It is history that deserves to be remembered. The air raid on Bari is one story of the air war over Europe during the Second World War, but just one day earlier, a B-17 named Damn Yankee was shot down over Belgium, leading to a remarkable story of survival and escape. Narrated by his daughter, Above and Beyond, the true survival story of Colonel Bruce Sunderland is a powerful reminder of the sacrifices and heroism over Europe's skies. I've talked to you before about Magellan TV, a true hidden treasure that is a rising star in the streaming world and the highest-rated documentary streaming app on Google Play. The reason that Magellan TV is so special is that it's all about the drama of real life, the lives of ancient pharaohs, critical battles in the World Wars I and II, soldiers who fought in the Civil War, and the battles for control of the British Crown, the Norman Conquest. In my opinion, Magellan TV has the largest and best collection of history shows anywhere. Run by documentary filmmakers, Magellan TV really is the best value among all those premium streaming documentary services that are out there today, both in price and in quality. Magellan TV adds more than 20 hours of new documentaries every week, and History Guide viewers can get a special offer of a 1-month free trial by going to trymagellantv.com/historyguy. Start streaming today, and you can watch Above and Beyond, the true survival story of Colonel Bruce Sunderland, as well as the rest of their history documentaries. And don't forget that Magellan TV also sells gift cards year-round. They're a great gift for any occasion. They allow you to give the gift a TV that is worth watching. I'll be sending them to my sons for Christmas, because they love history too. Bari lies on the Adriatic coast in southeastern Italy, today both a port of trade and a center of the cruise industry. Bari has been an important port since at least Roman times, mentioned in documents as early as 181 BC. The port had avoided significant damage during the Second World War. On September 11, 1943, following the September 3rd armistice of Cassibile between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies, the city, with a population of some 200,000, and its port were handed over without resistance to the British 1st Airborne Division. The port, just 150 miles from the new front lines, became a significant port supporting Allied operations on the peninsula. In October and November, it became the point of assembly for troops of the 2nd New Zealand Division, part of the British 8th Army, and acted as a main port of supply for that army. Writing in the October 1971 edition of American Heritage magazine, aviation historian Glenn Enfield wrote, "Bari was a pleasant, peaceful city on the heel of the peninsula. Little changed by the war except that in 1943, American and British military personnel crowded Victor Emmanuel Street instead of the Germans, who had been forced to flee northward." In addition, Bari had been selected as the new headquarters for the U.S. 15th Air Force, newly created in November and tasked with bombing operations in the Balkans, Italy, and Germany. The commander of the 15th Air Force, Major General James Doolittle, arrived in Bari on December 1st. The port was now a primary point of supply for both the British 8th Army and the U.S. 15th Air Force. A 2006 article on the website HistoryNet notes, as 1943 drew to a close, medieval torpor and somnolent grace were shaken off by the influx of Allied shipping into its harbor. Tons of supplies were offloaded almost around the clock, transforming the once quiet town into a hive of activity. But there was some concern. The general Allied consensus was that Hitler's Luftwaffe was weak and stretched thin in Italy, and so air defense at the port was lax and included just one anti-aircraft battery. British Army Captain A.B. Jenks, in charge of the port's defense, had raised concerns.
German bombers had managed attacks on the port of Naples 4 times in November.
But Bari had been provided little in terms of air defenses, and RAF fighter units in the area were assigned to defend bomber squadrons, not the port. It was in response to concerns about the air defenses at Bari that Air Marshal Cunningham had scheduled his press conference the afternoon of December 2nd.
The port was particularly busy that day, crowded with as many as 30 ships. Despite being in the British theater of operations, many of those ships were U.S. merchant vessels, including 8 Liberty ships, mass-produced vessels with a displacement of more than 14,000 tons that were the backbone of Allied supply from the United States. They carried food and equipment, as well as munitions and aviation fuel. The equipment for planned U.S. hospitals in the area was among the supplies waiting to be unloaded at the port, where ships were so packed that HistoryNet notes they almost touched. The 8th Army was preparing for their attack on Monte Cassino, a defining battle in the Italian campaign, and in the rush to offload supplies, the harbor was to be fully lit all night. But Hitler's Luftwaffe was not as defeated as the Allies thought. In fact, Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, commander of the German Air Force, had been working on a plan to use his forces in Italy to strike a blow that would delay the Allied advance. He had first considered an attack on the Allied airfields around Foggia, where the planes of Doolittle's 15th Air Force were stationed. But it was a complex target, and his field commanders thought that it was beyond the capabilities of their limited resources to attack such a large target. But veteran officer Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen, a World War I flying ace and first cousin of the Red Baron, who had served on the Eastern Front and was now in command of Luftflotte, or Air Fleet II, in the Mediterranean, suggested Bari. While the strategic effect might not be as large as a crippling attack on the 15th Air Force bases, damage at the port might slow the 8th Army's advance, as well as hamper the operations of the 15th Air Force. Infield writes that in the afternoon, Otto Heitmann, captain of the Liberty ship John Bascom, saw high in the sky, where the last rays of the sun glinted on its wings, a lone plane crossing directly over the crowded harbor. The plane was a German reconnaissance aircraft, a Messerschmitt Me-210 heavy fighter, piloted by Oberlieutenant Werner Hahn. In the noise of the busy port, none of those in charge of the port's defenses seemed to take notice. German patrols had become almost a nuisance and now rarely raised a response. Hahn saw how crowded the harbor was and hurried back to make his report. Kesselring approved the raid. Von Richthofen had originally hoped to be able to muster 150 Junkers Ju-88 medium bombers for the raid, but only 105 were available. The Ju-88 was a twin-engined multi-role aircraft designed as a fast bomber. With a range of approximately 1,110 miles and a bomb load of over 3,000 pounds, armed with both machine guns and cannons, the Ju-88 was a versatile and effective aircraft. Most of the bombers in the raid came from bases in northern Italy, although a few flew from bases in Yugoslavia. Von Richthofen had ordered them to first fly east into the Adriatic and then attack from the south and west. But because it was thought that the port defenses assumed an attack from the north, and because von Richthofen hoped the Allies might think that the raid had come from Yugoslavia and misdirect any retaliatory strikes. The plan was for the raid to commence at 7:30, just hours after Cunningham had done his press conference, assuring that the Luftwaffe was incapable of doing exactly that. Some of the bombers were supplied with Dupel, a type of chaff, thin strips of foil that confuse radar, while others carried flares to light the port, although those proved unnecessary. HistoryNet writes, First Lieutenant Gustav Tuber, leading the first wave, could hardly believe his eyes. The docks were brilliantly lit. Cranes stood out in sharp relief as they unloaded cargo from the ship's gaping holes, and the east jetty was packed with ships. Smithsonian Magazine wrote in 2020, as incendiaries rained down on the harbor, turning night into day, gunners aboard the anchored ship scrambled to shoot down the enemy. Too late. The attacking German airplanes fled into the night. The raid lasted less than 20 minutes. Infield writes, the first bomb explosions were off target and hit in the city, but as Captain Heitmann watched aboard the John Bascom, Tuber and his fellow pilots discovered their error and began walking the bombs out into the water towards the ships. The single anti-aircraft battery, confused by the chaff, was largely ineffective. Many of the ships had their own defenses, including naval armed guards aboard the Liberty ships, but the U.S. Naval History and Heritage Command writes, the blow was too sudden for armed guards to do much to defend their ships. Still, the guards aboard Heitmann's SS John Bascom were among the first to start firing. Among them was Naval Armed Guard Ensign K. Visoli. The 30-year-old resident of Rock Island, Illinois, had practiced law before the war. His wife was pregnant when he went to sea the previous August. Despite being wounded in the shoulder and over the heart, Ensign Vasoli went from gun to gun, directing action and rendering aid to the wounded and dying. The Bascom was struck by 3 bombs, the explosions throwing Captain Heitman against the wheelhouse door, which was torn from its hinges. Then an explosion aboard the Liberty ship SS John L. Motley caused the whole port side to cave in, and Heitman ordered the crew to abandon ship. Ensign Vasoli, despite his wounds, led a party below deck to recover the wounded and supervised loading them onto the lifeboat. His crews were said to have had to manually force him into the boat himself as he was seeking to rescue more wounded. Despite having lost the use of his right arm, he insisted on helping to row the lifeboat and then helping to disembark the wounded, and then he worked to help pull other men from the water. Fire raged in the city where the people were not accustomed to air attacks. Explosions rocked the harbor where the water quickly became covered with floating oil. Smithsonian writes, a ruptured bulk fuel pipeline sent thousands of gallons gushing into the harbor, where it ignited into a gigantic sheet of flame, engulfing the entire north side of the port. Flames leapt from ship to ship. Crews worked frantically to free ships before raging fires forced them to jump overboard and swim for it. The Liberty ship SS Joseph Wheeler had her starboard side blown out. The only survivors were men who had been in the town on Liberty. The engines aboard SS Samuel J. Tilden, carrying service passengers, were disabled by a direct hit. 10 crew, 14 U.S. and 3 British soldiers were killed. British ships sank her to prevent damage to other ships. Infield writes that the windows were blown from General Doolittle's office. Hurrying to the opening where the glass had been a minute before, Doolittle looked out at the harbor. One look was enough. His men, his supplies, his equipment for the 15th Air Force was gone. The SS John Harvey had sustained no direct hits, but was on fire. Captain Elwyn F. Knowles and his crew desperately fought the blazes on the ship, laden with a cargo of munitions. The explosion came suddenly. The only members of her crew to survive were a few ashore at the time of the attack. One of those, Deck Cadet James L. Cahill, exclaimed, Infield writes, "She's gone. John L. Harvey is gone." The explosion was massive. Many of the people in the city had fled from the flames towards the harbor. Infield writes, one moment they were rejoicing in their good fortune and escaping from the flames of the old city, and the next they were struck by the unbearable concussion of the blast. Some were blown upward, their broken bodies flying 25 to 30 feet high. Among those caught in the blast was Ensign Vasoli. Those injuries proved fatal. Navy records show that his last words were, "I have a 3-month-old baby at home. I certainly would like to see my baby." Having ignored his injuries to help others, he was posthumously awarded the Navy Cross, the Purple Heart, the European, African, Middle Eastern Campaign Medal, and the World War II Victory Medal. The award citation reads, "He was in every sense one of the finest heroes of World War II and typified the finest in the traditions of the Navy and the Armed Guard Service." 9 members of the John Bascom's Naval Armed Guard Detachment and 4 members of her crew were killed. The raid was devastating. In addition to the fires in the city, 17 ships had been sunk, including the Italian auxiliary cruiser Barletta, and 6 more damaged. Much of the city had been reduced to ashes, and the port was put out of action for 3 weeks. It was the worst loss of Allied shipping in a single attack since Pearl Harbor. It has often been called the Little Pearl Harbor. As for the Germans, only 1 aircraft was lost.
But the damage was even worse than it first appeared. Many of the people that had been pulled from the water were covered in an oily mixture. In the overwhelmed hospital, the medical personnel had prioritized people who were injured, who had burns, and they didn't even remove their clothes or wash them off. They simply gave them blankets and cups of tea. But by the next day, those oil-soaked men and the medical personnel started to suffer symptoms: chemical burns, blindness. Their lungs irritated, they started to cough, and then they started to die.
The destroyer, HMS Zetland, had been damaged and sent for repairs. By the time the ship arrived in Taranto, all of the officers on board were suffering from blindness, and they had asked for assistance to enter the harbor. The cause of the symptoms was a mystery to medical professionals, but was finally traced back to the John Harvey. The Allies were harboring a dark secret. In addition to regular munitions, the Victory ship had a cargo of 2,000 mustard gas bombs. While the U.S. had promised not to use chemical weapons, Germany had allegedly made a threat to use chemical warfare, and the bombs were sent for a potential retaliatory strike should they do so. When the ship exploded, it had caused the liquid sulfur mustard, the terrible chemical from the previous war, to pour into the harbor and become part of the oil mixture that coated nearly everyone who went into the water and fell like rain on bystanders after the explosion. There were chemical weapons experts aboard the John Harvey who knew of the cargo, but all were killed in the explosion. At least 83 of the military victims and an uncounted number of civilians died from the exposure. Tragically, had they quickly removed their clothes and washed off the oil, the chemical was diluted enough that they likely would not have suffered ill effect.
Eventually, Dr. Stuart F. Alexander, a chemical weapons expert on the medical staff of Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower, deduced the cause of the chemical burns, and that deduction ended up saving many lives. It's not clear exactly how many people died in the air raid on Bari, but estimates are as high as 1,000 military personnel and a like number of civilians. And no one knows how many of those were caused by the bombing and how many were caused by the mustard gas. At first, the Supreme Allied High Command refused to even admit that the chemical was present, afraid that it would provoke the Germans, but with so many witnesses, they were forced to admit to the accident the following February. Still, details were classified until 1959, and the full extent of the disaster wasn't known until Glenn Enfield wrote his book Disaster at Bari in 1967. In a twist, tissue samples taken by Dr. Alexander at Bari ended up playing a role in the development of an early form of chemotherapy for cancer. Dr. Alexander's contributions after the air raid at Bari were finally officially acknowledged by the Surgeon General of the United States Army in 1988. On April 9th, 1945, the Liberty ship SS Charles Henderson exploded in Bari Harbor. It was carrying some 2,000 tons of aerial explosives. This second disaster at Bari killed 360 people and injured 1,700 more. I hope you enjoyed this episode of The History Guy. Check out our community on thehistoryguyguild.locals.com, our webpage at thehistoryguy.com, and our merchandise at teespring.com, or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo. And if you'd like more episodes on Forgotten History, all you have to do is subscribe.